So I have written the balance adjustment code, and I'm testing it now. It runs pretty quickly, so I want to make sure that the data I'm running it on is correct. So I'm going to talk to Ian this morning and make sure that the data I'm running it on is correct, and then I can publish the balances, the balance adjustments. So we have the what will be published is a map of addresses and their adjustments, and then the application to the wallet's record for that address, so what it changes to, and then along with that, there'll also be a cryptographic proof of that adjustment. So the every path path of transactions that starts from the tainted addresses and ends at the address that we're talking about will be supplied, but we'll keep that separate. It'll just be available for those who want to go over those for themselves. So it's reporting right now, but I want to go over it a couple of times before I go ahead and publish the results. Any questions about that?
Greg, what language did you write it in?
I just wrote it in Scala. It was the simplest thing to do. I would love to get the data interactively from Etherscan, but that was taking too long. The Etherscan was closing the connection, so I'm using data that we downloaded all at once. That literally just takes a few seconds to run. All right, well, if there are no other questions about that, I do have a sort of fun topic, which I think illustrates several key points related to the interactive models of computing. So I was thinking about it the other day, and I realized that there's something quite intriguing about the practice of music and a potential missed opportunity. If you look at the sort of standard, the modern forms of ensemble playing, whether you're looking at an orchestra, a rock band, or an African drum circle, one of the things that is notable is that the musicians themselves only interact through sound. They don't. In other words, the interaction is post the production of sound, and we might say that post the production of music, or the involvement of music. Now there are a few, but you might imagine that you could go the other way, that it is the act of interacting that creates the music. Now that's not how things are organized materially in ensemble playing in any culture that I know about. There are a few sort of borderline cases that have come up only very recently. So there are some ensembles that have taken an instrument like a guitar or a banjo, and everybody plays a part on the same instrument. This it came to my attention through some duets um, played on a single guitar. But then I've seen groups play songs on a single guitar, so everyone has a small role to play, um, and there's a sort of narrowly defined range of behaviors so they don't get in each other's way. So that's an instance where it's more like common physical interaction to produce the music, as so all of the parties are interacting with the same instrument to produce music. So that's a borderline case for the general case of having the music interact and music arise from the interaction. Let me stop there and make sure that I'm making sense to people. Is this making sense? Is everyone following along?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, although I'm not completely following. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll keep going. Now, you could imagine, especially with modern technology, that you generate uh, through you read the interaction and then turn that interactive data into music. So for example, you could imagine the players are wearing data suits, a generalization of data gloves, so that when they touch each other, the data suit reads the gesture, reads the touch, and generates data, which is then interpreted musically. So here's a very simple way to parse this out. I'm not saying that this is the only way. I'm just giving this as an example. So it is. I've noted several times in the past that you can take a series of notes and split them into a series of pitch data and a series of rhythmic data. So if you another way of saying it is, if you have a stream of pitch data, that's not enough to create a note or a stream of notes, because you need to know how long to play the pitches for. And likewise, if you have a stream of duration data, you don't know exactly what pitch or what timbre or sound to play for that period of time. But if you have two such streams, then you can zip the streams together, and when they are zipped together, you produce a playable note. And I use this as the basis for designing a virtual instrument, which I call skein, where the player is given a visualization of two ribbons that can be zipped together, and then there are certain gestures that a singular player, can make to either advance the ribbons or twist the ribbons or zip them together to start playing. So that's again, that was when I was sort of conceptualizing music in the way that I think most people in the culture do. But you could take the same idea and and apply it to two players. So now imagine that each player is wearing two data gloves, like the kind that Imogen Heap has developed for making music. And certain classes of gestures generate pitch data, and certain classes of gestures generate rhythmic data. But it's only when the parties make contact that the streams of pitch and rhythmic data that each player is generating start to zip together. So you can imagine, something very simple, like, there are up gestures which generate rhythmic data, and down gestures in a single hand that generate pitch data, and it's only when the two hands connect or clasp, let's say the left hand to the right hand of player one and player two, that they start to zip the data that they are generating with their gestures, and so in this way, the interaction is generating the data, and that is then being interpreted in such a way as to produce sound and hopefully music. Let me stop there and check in and see if people are following along.
So can we think about this zipping as very simple way of interaction?
That's right. Zipping is a as simple a kind of interaction as possible. So so zipping is the model of bringing two data streams together in such a way to produce music, right? And then we're mapping that on to a human gesture of interaction.
Correct.
Right? And yes, go ahead.
Does the data glove, what does it do? Track the location of the hand or the fingers or something?
Data gloves track, if I remember correctly, I'd have to go check. And there are a bunch of different kinds of sensors that will do this, right? There's also the leap motion device that uses infrared sensors. But the data glove, if I remember correctly, tracks the orientation and the orientation of the whole hand and the fingers, and then tracks gestures with the fingers.
Can we also think this in a recursive way, that interaction between fingers and the hand orientation is also like an interaction, and
yes,
just
of course.
combining?
Yeah, of course. But that's a little closer to the way we do music now. I'm the thing about fingers is that they're not actually autonomous, right? They're all connected to a single hand. Whereas the thing about people is that they are, at least in many respects, autonomous. Right? So what we're looking at, and this is part of the reason I'm pointing this out is that we can see that there's something about human cognition that has been hampered when it comes to the interaction of autonomous agents. So I mean, there's literally thousands of years of human history, but it wasn't until the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, that we get theories of mathematical theories of autonomous interaction, computing arising as the interaction of autonomous agents. So that's really something to think about, right? There's like a hole in human cognition that it would take so long for that to occur, and that this observation about the way music is organized and supported in terms of the built environment that we, the instruments that we build, and even the kind of concert halls that are used for performing and listening to music. All of that also supports this, or is evidence for what I'm trying to say, which is that we have very limited understanding of the interaction of autonomous agents, and that has been a major stumbling block. It's also related to an observation I made, which is why I switched from yoga as one of my primary exercise forms to Tai Chi. After 12 years of doing Bikram yoga at least twice a week, I observed that even after that long of practice, I when it came time to practice, I was standing on my mat alone. And even though I was practicing with a group of other practitioners, there was no interaction. We were effectively alone in our practice. Whereas in Tai Chi, although you may do the form on your own, the purpose and intent of the form, and certainly as you go further into the practice, is interaction with other parties, right? Tai Chi is a martial art, and there are practices for interaction, such as push hands and other things. So Tai Chi has a more whole conception, which is that there's both autonomy and interaction, and that was what convinced me that I wanted to switch from my yoga practice to Tai Chi practice. It also the interesting point about this observation of music and the way we play music is that what will happen is that dance becomes music making, right? So these two different forms of expression become more unified through this particular approach to interpreting interaction. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that it can lead to the design of a whole bunch of new kinds of instruments. But it illustrates something that's very profound and touches a wide range of human experience, from how we formalize our notions of our mathematical expressions of the world, to how we think about making art and music and even exercise and martial practice. So all of these are connected in this sense of how we think about autonomy and interaction. I think this is, to me, this is sort of one of the things that makes me excited and want to get out of bed in the morning is sort of this recasting and fresh understanding of my own experience and maybe the experience of others as well. Does that make sense? It's a fairly broad ranging topics, but I thought it might be of interest to folks.
Yeah, I can definitely agree that yoga is more like a long practice, and yeah, this is my experience also.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that this represents a fresh opportunity for humanity, and I think that this idea of having interaction be primary is something that's really it's quite important. It may even be related to why the dominant culture is so rough on the environment, because the dominant culture doesn't have the right tools for being able to understand its impact, because most of its tools are not interaction based. Most of its conceptual, artistic, cultural tools for apprehending the world are not interaction based. Now, there's one interesting exception to this, which is physics. A whole bunch of physics needs to arise from the perspective of interaction, right? So a lot of physics is about particle interaction, as an example. But what's interesting is how how do I say it? The mathematics still, by and large, is not expressed in terms of interaction, but rather from a kind of God's eye point of view, as if you could see the whole thing. And that ends up being quite problematic for physics, and is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to connect quantum mechanics to general relativity. But that said, at least within physics, there is this notion of interaction as primary or central. So that's an indication that there's something in physics that's worthwhile in terms of conceptual tools for thinking about interaction. Anyway, so that's that. I wanted to pass that along because it occurred to me just recently, and I thought, now here's an interesting way to think about how revolutionary models like the pi calculus actually are. When you translate its fundamental principles, so for the pi calculus, the principle is that computing arises as interaction. That's the trick that the pi calculus does. And when you translate that idea over into other domains, such as music making, lo and behold, you get brand new forms of music making and brand new kinds of instruments. So that gives someone a sense of just how profound this shift in models is, and why it might be that it's taken a long time for the culture to absorb the real import.
Today, we already see this need for interaction, right, with social media, but this doesn't fulfill what we need, right?
So I agree with you. Yes. So that's actually a really important point, right? I mean, Jaron Lanier makes this point. He talks about he talked about it in the 80s. He was talking about how broadcast media, essentially holds people hostage, right? So they become zombies because it's only one direction. Whereas the computer turns the instruments of broadcast media into things that are more like telephones. So, and which is why social media is so sticky, because people who were alienated because there wasn't an ability to interact now gain brand new forms of interaction. So people find it very sticky. But you're right, the conceptualization of interaction doesn't shift. People know they need it, but they don't know how to think about it or how to engage it in a way that's fruitful.
Yeah. Or how to extend it or change it. It's just how it is built from someone else, and you can only use it. And
Yeah, that's right. And you know, and in many ways, it's also, I mean, it's this is very deep in in the human cultural history. So, for example, we don't we don't invent the language we receive from our mother, right? We receive it and bootstrap our conceptualization of the world before we even get a chance to think about whether or not that language is, you know, a virus, you know, get you know, embedding in our conceptualization a particular set of biases about the world that may not be helpful. Um, and you know, it's, you know, it might be a very long time before we encounter another language that opens our eyes as to the possibility of a different organization. Um, so, you know, for most people, or for a lot of people, you know, you learn the language, you know, that's spoken in your home, and then you might learn some other languages as you wander outside your home. Um, but there isn't a lot of introspection about, you know, the fact that the language is received as opposed to created. So that's a although I, you know, again, there are always exceptions to these kinds of things. As I understand it, the Semitic languages are based on sort of three consonant forms, and so it's possible to create words on the fly, that like one basic form of competence amongst the speakers of Hebrew or Arabic, is that, you know, an 8-year-old child can create a word from one of these three consonant triples, and everyone will understand exactly what they. So that's, I think, is an interesting aspect of the Semitic languages, and sets them apart in terms of their overall um, um, sense of the use of the tool to for creative purposes. Anyway, so just a thought. It's not directly related to Casper. I do think there are lots of interesting blockchain applications of this idea, but I think the idea itself is deeper and richer than the blockchain, and you know, I think uh, uh, it's certainly worth contemplating. You know, what happens when we shift our perspective to interaction. Well,
For me, it's very.
Go ahead.
It's very interesting what you explained about reflection and how can we see like inner things larger than outside, right? So is this also some kind of shift where we are now used to think about that outside is always larger. So and the physics is telling us that, but you are saying that with interaction this can be also reversed with the reflection and.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I said that. Go ahead.
When you talk about biological life-like programs, when you can supply in reflection and
yeah, I thought you were just referring to the scope of this conversation. Yeah. So that's an interesting aspect, at least in the row calculus, in order to make it consistent. you have to impose a particular discipline. So the discipline that I impose is that there's an alternation between term constructors and name constructors. You can't have a name constructor applied directly to it. You have to make a term with that name, and then you can apply it, a name constructor recursively. So and what this does is it gives you this incredibly potent thing, which is that at least when it comes to freshness and scope, that process cannot mention a name that mentions the process, at least in the ordinary row calculus, right? So P can't have a name in it that contains P in ordinary row calculus. So in that sense, the ordinary row, if again, this is under the assumption that your names represent interiority and processes represent exteriority. Then in that case, the inner world of the process is always smaller than its outer world. But what you can do is there's an extension of the row calculus in which you allow for fixed points with respect to names. So you can think of a name as defined by an equation, and that equation can be recursive. In that case, then the interior world can be at least as big as the outside world, right? So, and if you think of, when you ask sort of what's the interiority of a process P, well, if the process P interacts with other processes that send it names that are defined by recursive equations that are bigger than P or include P, then you can now get the P's, sort of inner world can be much larger than its own, than its own surface area. So you can build TARDIS-like, TARDIS-like constructions in that. But that's an interesting point. I mean, go ahead.
Does this implies that there is some kind of barrier between inner and outer world, because we need to ensure that names does not collide. So, like special force.
Well, at least in the row count. I mean, again, the row calculus is just a toy, right? It's just a mathematical gadget. But in the row calculus, again, in order for things to work out consistently, you need a distinction between name and process, and then you need a discipline as to how they flip back and forth. But because you can flip them back and forth, the barrier is porous. What's inner can become outer, and what's outer can become inner. That's the whole idea of reflection. Let's see. It doesn't mean that this is, of course, the only way that you might slice and dice things. Right? So there are probably other theories that also against this kind of thing. But at least with respect to these kinds of musings, I'd like to be very, very careful. Right? So for, it's very easy to wander off into imagination, and then it's possible to get very lost. But at least as long as you have a mathematical discipline and you stick to proof, then you can navigate in a way that you won't necessarily get lost. It's still possible to get quite lost, but there's some guidance. All right, let's see. So I will yield back the time to everyone, and see some people at Dev Stand Up in a little bit.
Very
And,
good. Thanks for the
Thanks for today.
thanks for the discussion.
Oh, likewise. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Have a good day, everyone.